There is so much evidence against the claims of Christianity that sometimes I forget to cover the more blatant examples. I like to talk about the problem of evil or suffering or divine hiddenness or the issues with heaven or hell or the evolution of this religion as it started from a Canaanite pantheon in through Jewish mythology into the Christian rebranding and why. But sometimes it's simpler than all of that. Sometimes we can just go back to the text. We can go back to the claims of Jesus. After all, if you talk to a lot of Christians, they base a lot of their, well, what's your proof? The validity of Christianity relies on the person and character of Jesus Christ, and specifically that done by the prophecies and how he fulfilled them and how he works into the New Testament idea of what this God did for us with the sacrifice and the atonement. So I have 5 examples for you today. And I think they're important examples because when you're a believer, you take on faith so easily that the gospel is reliable, that even if you are one of the progressive Christians that understand we don't know who wrote the gospels and you believe in the timing that they were written, many of those progressive believers still have no problem with what's actually written, even if they concede the issues with authorship and dating. But I think the issues go much further past that. And oftentimes they go on to those New Testament writers, specifically today, I'm mainly talking about gospel authors, as they try to invent a Jesus that matches Old Testament prophecy. And I have 5 examples of that for you today. Some you've probably heard, some are hopefully new to you, but in all of them, I hope to give you a fuller picture and a clearer understanding than maybe you've had in the past. So here's the 5 issues I have for today. The first one is a big one. I don't know how you get around it. I don't know how any Christian can claim they've read their Bible and then say something like this. But the verse in the New Testament that Christians like to point to as a fulfillment of Scripture, and that's the reason it's written, you'll see that in a second. Here, let me just read it to you, is Matthew 2. I'll start in 14. Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt. So this is Joseph taking Mary and Jesus to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I have called my son. So this is the book of Matthew. Matthew is reading Old Testament scriptures from the prophets, and he's trying to piece Jesus' story together so that, he literally says that this was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord to the prophet. So what prophet is he talking about? All we have to do is look up out of Egypt I called my son, which is Hosea 11:1. Let me read this for you. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. People accuse me of reading the Bible poorly all the time, that I'm not considering the context, that I'm cherry picking verses to meet my point. No, that's what the author of the book of Matthew was doing. Jesus is not Israel. This is not a futuristic prophecy. This is a description of past events. All you have to do is keep reading. This is truly mind-boggling. Verse 2, the more I called them, the more they went from me. So now he has switched it to the word them because he's talking about who? Israel. Further proof that it's not about a singular individual that happens to be the Son of God that would be crucified for our atonement and redemption. We have the author of Matthew clearly taking this verse incorrectly out of context and making it about Jesus when he's not, and it gets worse. The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to the idols. Was Jesus sacrificing to false gods and idols? No. In context, we know that here in Hosea, it's about Israel during a time of their ingratitude, looking back on what happened from the Exodus. This is not about Jesus. And yet, we have the author of one of the 4 Gospels where we get so much of our idea about who this Jesus is and what he did and what he accomplished, specifically saying, in contradiction, by the way, to other Gospel writers, that Jesus has this time period in Egypt, and he's clearly doing it to make a fulfillment of prophecy. But the problem clearly is that prophecy is not even a prophecy, and it's definitely not about Jesus. It's so unbelievably simple. If that doesn't bring into question everything else in Matthew or the Gospels or the Bible. I don't know what does. And see, what Christians do is they say, yeah, we've progressed. This isn't inerrant. There are contradictions, or we would say purviews. It actually proves the validity of the story. And, the dating's not an issue. People writing 10, 20, 30, 40, 90 years after the fact, they have differences about what they believe about when these were written or by whom. But my point is, even the ones that concede to the fullest never go far enough. They never are consistent. They never say clearly, this verse doesn't work. Matthew becomes not credible, or the author of Matthew becomes not credible. And if that can happen in one gospel that we've considered canon, maybe it could happen in all four, right? It's this kind of thing that shows the human fingerprints, the manipulation, the error, so different than just normal fallibility and copying errors and the other things that Christians try to get us to minimize and soften these effects to. No. This is purposeful manipulation and or misunderstanding of Scripture by the first book of the New Testament that is telling us how Jesus fulfilled prophecy, and that is such evidence for so many believers. This has to be contended with. But I have another example. In fact, I have a few more. Let's move on to number 2. Isn't it funny that only 2 of the 4 Gospels even describe a virgin birth? Mark, our earliest, and John, our latest, just leave this out. To be fair, they don't really have a nativity story at all, but you would think they would have thought it would have been important, especially John with all of the higher claims he's trying to make to back this up. But anyways, we'll cover the one in Matthew. Let me read it for you. Matthew 1:22 through 23. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel. So we have Matthew doing the exact same thing. He describes an event in the prior verses, and he says, see, this event proves, it fulfills Scripture. And then he quotes that Scripture for us. That Scripture comes from Isaiah 7:14. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. This is the NRSVUE. This is, from my understanding, from a scholarly perspective, the best modern translation. And it has young woman appropriately translated here from the Hebrew word Alma. First of all, I'd encourage all of you to go look up the context for Isaiah 7. King Ahaz is terrified by these 2 enemies. Isaiah is giving Ahaz a sign. Hey, before this kid is even old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, these 2 kings will be long gone. Now, I hate getting into some of this because I am not a Hebrew scholar, but what I do know and feel very confident in saying is that Alma is typically used to refer to a young woman of marrying age. It does not ever mean specifically virgin. The problem is where the Septuagint mistranslated Isaiah. The Septuagint uses the word Parthenos, normally virgin. The author of Matthew is working off of this Septuagint, which is the Greek translated Old Testament, essentially, or what they would have called the Hebrew Bible. And so it's not even Matthew's fault this time. He's working with what he's got, but what he's got is a bad translation. And this is just the perfect evidence that goes against all of the Christians that try to argue that the only translation issue differences and the only things, copyist errors, these textual errors that we have, none of them mean anything. None of them are related to salvation or the personal nature of Jesus Christ. Wanna bet? Think about the implications of this. It's wrong in every way that it can be wrong. First of all, it's wrong from the gospel writer's perspective that Jesus did this. It brings that into question. If we're told that the only reason Matthew shared that Jesus was born of a virgin was to fulfill prophecy that we know wasn't A, prophecy, and B, even about Jesus, which is beyond clear if you read that verse in context, then the whole house of cards falls down. These 2 examples alone, I think, very fairly bring into question all gospel claims, which is to say Christianity. Let me give you a third one. This time we will use Mark. I'm going to read to you first Mark 1:2 through 3. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, see, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. It's another gospel author trying to have things match up on purpose to what they consider to be Old Testament prophecy. And in this case, he calls out the prophet Isaiah, but that's not Isaiah. It's Malachi 3:1, with a little bit of Exodus 23:20. One of the lines, the voice crying out in the wilderness, is from Isaiah 43. Well, what's the big deal? He quoted from 3. He only attributed it to 1. Well, some of it is the changes that have been made. Some later manuscripts say, as it was written in the prophets. But the earliest manuscripts specifically say in Isaiah. Later scribes had to have changed the text after noticing the error. This gets worse the more that you look at it. In Isaiah 43, the part that he did get right from Isaiah, in context, we know what this is about. The wilderness highway that's being prepared for Yahweh as Israel returns from captivity in Babylon. Mark recontextualizing that around John preparing for Jesus is wrong. Like, we really know that's about the Babylonian exile, the end of the exile. Like, Christian scholars know this, and yet Mark applies it to Jesus, and we're all fine with it as proof of fulfilled prophecy. And he was wrong. It had to be fixed. Later scribes had to change the words. Now, again, this is just example 3, and I'm only going to give you 5 examples, but there's so many. And once you see it like this, even if there's cases that we don't know that it's the case, who's to say that it's not? It makes the whole thing untrustworthy. That's the point. You lose all credibility. Not just, well, it's perfect or it's divinely written. Of course, there's going to be some human errors. No, you lose credibility about even amidst those human errors, what the actual message is and if it is valid and true. The next one's kind of a funny one. It's back to Matthew. I know that so many of you know about it, but it fits too well here. I'll start by reading. Let's go back to Matthew 21, 1-7. When they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this, the Lord needs them, and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. And then the quote, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Just to finish it up, the disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. Okay, this is our New Testament verse, the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy that is called out and quoted by the author of Matthew. What's being quoted from is Zechariah 9:9. "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humbled and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Zechariah used very standard Hebrew synonymous parallelism. That's one animal being described twice. Riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He's specifying, not adding. Mark, Luke, and John knew how to read it, and so they just mentioned one animal. But Matthew has Jesus giving words to Jesus, has him be wrong, in contradiction to the other Gospels and to the original supposed prophecy from Zechariah. Like, just help me. Like, sometimes I think these things are so silly and so obvious that they just get dropped. Like, yeah, what else are you going to do with them? What are you going to do with them? How are they not affecting your view of Christianity? How are you reconciling for them? The earlier gospel of Mark that is written before Matthew pulls this same move, but is reading the prophecy like most people, and so only has one animal. Matthew invents a second one, attributes new words to Jesus' mouth and new actions to his followers to try and fulfill what his understanding of the prophecy was, which was just wrong, which isn't surprising here for Matthew at this point, or the author that wrote the book of Matthew. Let's go to another anonymous book, because at this point, who really cares? Let's go to Hebrews. I'll read to you from Hebrews 10, and I'll start with 5. "Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, 'Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure.'" It goes on from there, but that's really all we need. He's quoting Psalm 40. It's sacrifice and offering you did not desire, you opened or dug ears for me. Dug ears for me. There is no body. Now stay with me on this. I know it's not as common as some of the other examples. The gospel examples always get all the focus. But this is a major mistranslation error. Hebrews is turning "you opened my ears" into "you prepared a body for me," and then assigning that to Jesus. The psalm is actually it's a very interesting psalm to look at, something we should do another one on, because it seems to suggest that sacrifice is not required or liked, that God prefers obedience. Preference is still very different than like duty and law, but that's what is being said here. You have given me ears to hear you and thus to obey. That's what you did. Not prepared a body for me, but the Septuagint says a body you prepared for me. But again, forget these little errors. The bigger thing that I'm trying to point out in each of these examples is that then the New Testament writer, in this case the author of the book of Hebrews, is taking the incorrect mistranslated word of body and making it central to his entire argument about Christ. Like, this is where we get doctrinal concepts of Jesus's body or bodily sacrifice, replacing the old sacrificial system. This is new covenant theology, and it's not the only place we get it, but it's a main one, and it's based incorrectly on a bad translation from a poetic book of wisdom literature. But I'm the one who doesn't treat the text well, that doesn't understand context, that is cherry picking. Christians have been doing this since Christianity was invented. And once you start looking, it's endless. It's not just the New Testament writers, it's Old Testament writers. It's not just differences that can be chalked up to personality. It's mutually exclusive claims. It's contradictions between the Gospels based off what access of information they had to and their human understanding. And it's affecting real doctrine, real words and actions of Jesus. You can't say it doesn't matter. You can't say it's small. You can't say it doesn't exist. What can you say? At the very least, I think you have to say, again, that this shines a huge light on if we can trust the Bible in general, specifically the New Testament, specifically what we know about Jesus, and specifically why we think he was the Messiah. I cover this a bit more in detail from a different vantage point in my conversation with Justin. So if you haven't checked out that podcast episode, please do. I think you'll find it very interesting if you enjoyed this. So to recap, Isaiah 7 was not talking about a virgin, nor was it even intended to be a prophecy. Hosea wasn't predicting Jesus going to Egypt. He was talking about what had already happened and how the one called out of Egypt, the Israelites themselves, were being disobedient and worshiping false idols. Again, not about Jesus and not a prophecy. Zechariah wasn't talking about 2 donkeys, which the other gospel authors understood, but not Matthew. And he tried to use it and put words and actions into Jesus's mouth and deeds to create a true error, not just a misunderstanding, not even just a contradiction, truly an error. Mark is quoting from 3 books when he says he's quoting from 1. And again, we know it's not about John and Jesus. It's about the Israelites returning from exile in Babylon. And Psalm 40 is not about Jesus's body and a new covenant. So just come on. And by the way, some of you will make typology excuses here, but it's not what was claimed. When one of the authors says this was done to fulfill Scripture, that Scripture has to actually mean that thing. It can't be working in 2 ways just because you want it to. Typology has got to be the biggest cop-out and excuse ever, but because Christians have a word that they can say, nope, this is what it is, and it's actually really neat, and it actually goes above and beyond, then they think they've solved it. You haven't. You're clearly settling for an idea that had to be made up after the fact to reconcile clear error in your Scripture. And if you want to have those, have them. But then stop talking about how amazingly well the Old Testament predicted Jesus and using that as proof of Christianity and proof of fulfilled prophecy. No. And I think if there was one question asked through this whole thing, it's, did the scriptures that come before Jesus predict the story of Jesus? I don't think that they did. I think they were clearly recontextualized, refigured, reframed by these authors to map onto a person that they liked. But if you read the Hebrew Bible, there's no Jesus in it. Not Isaiah 53. None of these things are there. He doesn't fulfill one single messianic prophecy. And the Christian excuse to that is that he did, but in a spiritual sense. then how bad is your God at getting all of his prophets and patriarchs of the religion to understand the end goal? No, we know what they were under thought-wise, impression-wise, prophecy-wise, what they thought the Messiah would be, and for good reason. Jesus doesn't fit that mold. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Ann, Chris, Greysteel, Jimmy, Joe, Kitboga, Lori, Matthew, and Perry; my Humanist heroes, Chris, James, Jarrod, and Kristi; my Atheist advocates, Aquitar, Caleb, Dakota, Dan, Jeff, Jeffrey, Jugs, Julie, Melissa, Paul, Rege, Sparky, and Thomas; as well as all of my secular scholar patrons and new Mindshifter members. Thank you so much for your support. It means more than you can ever know.